Morning. Morning. Is this working? I'm waving to the Thurman scholars seated in the balcony there, you see above the owl. See Dr. Fluker, Walter Fluker, the editor of the Howard Thurman Papers Project. Dr. Anthony Neal, who you will hear from this evening. He's going to interview our speaker, Dr. Peter Eisenstadt, who will be more formally introduced in a moment. And that looks like that is Dr. Luther Smith. Ah, there he is, yes. And he's the retired theologian at Emory, from Emory University's School of Theology, Candler. And I see Professor Kipton Jensen from Morehouse. All of these gentlemen have published on Howard Thurman. We're delighted that you are the chosen few to represent the physical distancing to experience this historical treat. For our call to order, I'd like you to hear this. We welcome you today honoring the 40th Morehouse College Crown Forum, dedicated to the 122nd Appearance Day anniversary, celebrating the Reverend Dr. Howard Washington Thurman. Morehouse class of 1923. Our being in the Academy this morning, where the emphasis is on thinking, is a good time for us to remember Dr. Thurman's words that the mind is a theater of simultaneous possibilities, and that the mental environment is the arena where connections are made for actualizing potentials. The signature theme of Dr. Thurman's ministry for many is the search for common ground. Finding that common ground is in the current climate of our nation and world will evolve humanity's actualizing potentials. That's one of Dr. Thurman's expressions. Actualizing potentials toward global peace. What is that? What is peace? The integrity of right relationships. First with yourself, with our neighbors, with the community, the environment, with the larger social order, with the planet, and with the cosmos, our universal home. For Dr. Thurman, discovering common ground is the basis for experiencing sustainable cooperation, the highest level of spirituality. It follows for Thurman that if our cooperation is not sustainable, then it is not just. Justice is a synonym for sustainability. When the ground under us is not common, there is no positive peace. Without a just peace, there can be no co-creating of the beloved cosmic community. The most important aspect of being on the spiritual path may be simply to keep moving toward common ground. In the spiritual journey, you cannot be a wine taster. You have to become a drunk. Now I invite the Vice President of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel Assistance, Ms. Ayanna Lane, to come forth and give us our evocation for the morning. Ayanna is a senior. Nope, not according to this. You are a senior, so this is a mistake. I thought so. At Spelman College, please rise.
Good morning, you all. May we all assume a posture of prayer, bowing your heads, closing your eyes, opening your hearts. Now, as we pause for a moment and become still, sensing and accepting that where we are in the infinite presence of God is, know that the purpose of prayer is not to change God's mind, which always knows our wholeness and our worth. The purpose of prayer is to change our own minds so we can see through the eyes of God. And through these eyes, I call upon love, a love that knows no boundaries, greater than any opposition, spanning all distances and ages. Love brings together what has been apart and reminds of our true nature. As we rest in love's embrace, in our kindness, in our acts of kindness, in our thoughts, the magic of love infuses our lives. Today, may we see with the eyes of God. Let us lift our vision from the small and insignificant and focus on the truth of love as we embrace each other's spirits here today. And love, knowing that they are divine centers of life. May we use each moment as a new opportunity to walk our talk, to make our lives meaningful through our actions, and to prove the presence of God through our deeds. Amen.
If you're using your apps this morning, on the back of the program, you will see we have listed for you all of those young men who have been recipients of the Martin Luther King Jr. Scholarship, made possible by the people who mentored me and raised me in Columbus, Ohio. They hold a breakfast every year, which is the largest sit-down meal event in the nation, honoring Dr. King. And since 1990, a Morehouse chapel assistant has been the recipient of a $10,000 scholarship. And a few years, the attendance was so large, they made the scholarship $15,000. Traditionally, on today, we announce the surprise of who will be the recipient of that scholarship. And the person is in the room. Hold your breath as I make the announcement of the name. You may quietly ask yourself, Lord, is it I? The recipient this year will be Mr. Tyler Micah Washington. Micah, won't you stand? So in January, he'll be $10,000 richer, and he will have the opportunity to use that any way he chooses. You don't have to applaud. You may be seated. You're so welcome. And now Micah is going to come and introduce our distinguished speaker this morning, Mr. Peter Eisenstadt.
Good morning. Dr. Peter Eisenstadt received his doctorate in history from NYU. He is the author of Against the Hounds of Hell, A Life of Howard Thurman, and was the associate editor of the 5 volumes of the Papers of Howard Washington Thurman. With Walter Earl Fluker, he is the co-editor of Walking with God, the sermon series of Howard Thurman, and co-author with Quentin Dixie of Visions of a Better World, Howard Thurman's Pilgrimage to India and Origins of African American Nonviolence. He was the managing editor of the Encyclopedia of New York City and the editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia of New York State. He was the author of Rockdale Village, Robert Moses, 6,000 Families, and New York City's Greatest Experiment in Integrated Housing. He was awarded the New York Society Library Prize for the best book on New York City history. He lives in Clemson, North Carolina, and is an affiliate scholar in the Clemson University History Department. After a selection by the world-renowned Morehouse College Glee Club, please receive Dr. Peter Eisenstadt.
There's gonna be no rocks crying for me, my Lord. No rocks crying for me. I'm gonna live so you can use me, Lord. No rocks are crying for me. I'm gonna work so God can use me. I'm gonna work so God. I'm gonna work so God can use me, my Lord. I'm gonna work so God. I'm gonna work so God. I'm gonna work so God can use me. I'm gonna walk so God can use me. Anytime. alone. No one's crying for me. No one's crying, no one's crying for me. I'm gonna live so you can use me, Lord. No rocks are crying for me. I'm gonna live so God can use me. I'm gonna live so God. I'm gonna live so God. God can use me. I'm gonna live so God can use me. Anytime, Lord, anywhere. Use me, Lord. I'm gonna live so you can use me, Lord. Anytime, anywhere. Anytime, anywhere.
I'd like to thank Micah for that very generous introduction. And it was wonderful hearing the Morehouse College Glee Club. Howard Thurman was a member of the Morehouse Glee Club. Oh, let me speak into the microphone. Yeah, I think that's fine. So, what a tremendous, humbling honor it is to be asked to deliver the Crown Lecture here at Morehouse. I would like to thank Dean Carter and everyone here who made this possible, and those who have made time in their busy schedule to listen to me. A personal comment, if I may. When I was working on the Howard Thurman Papers Project about 15 years ago, the head of the project, the Reverend Dr. Walter Earl Fluker, was on the faculty here. And I had a number of occasions to visit Morehouse to have editorial meetings with my colleagues. I loved coming to visit. Morehouse College ceased to be a mere abstraction, something I had only read about. It became a real, concrete, geographic space filled with real buildings and real people. And as a historian, as I walked around the campus, I tried to imagine what Morehouse looked like and what being a student here felt like 100 years ago, when Howard Thurman walked the grounds. And I want you to join me in doing some historical imagining. So let me start by turning the clock back to February 15th, 1942, in the middle of what was then called Negro History Week. Howard Thurman, then Dean of Chapel at Howard University, delivered a sermon at Sale Hall at Morehouse in honor of the college's 75th anniversary. He was invited by Morehouse president, his old friend, Benjamin Mays. And Thurman turned the clock back to 1867, speaking of Morehouse's first class of students, almost all of whom had been, prior to emancipation, enslaved. Thurman remarked that their exposure to education had, in his word, buoyed them into the fulfillment of a possibility that staggered their imagination by putting over them a crown that for the rest of their lives they tried to grow tall enough to wear. Thurman would often speak of that crown to Morehouse students and others. It had many meanings for Thurman. What was that crown? What I think Thurman was telling Morehouse students that in a good education, your professors only can give you the tools, but you have to figure things out for yourself. If you only accept their answers and don't pose your own questions, you will not be able to stretch toward that crown. Also, stretching to the crown is not just a personal endeavor. It is the sort of crown that everybody has to wear or no one can. And the important thing is the stretching, not the wearing. You might get close, But after your best effort, you will have to pass on the task in the Hebrew words of Psalm 146, Lador Vador, from generation to generation. In some ways, Howard Thurman has never left Morehouse. And as I am sure you know, his ashes and those of his second wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, are interred in a monument in front of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel. But it was during his undergraduate years that he gained the tools to learn what Morehouse could and could not provide him. It put a crown over his head that he spent the rest of his life trying to reach. So join me in imagining what Morehouse was like in the fall of 1919 when Thurman entered Morehouse as a freshman. It was the first full academic year since the end of World War I. Some students who studied had been interrupted by the war were back on campus. Morehouse President John Hope, who had been in Europe the previous year working with the YMCA on behalf of black troops, was back in Atlanta as well. John Hope was one of the many African American leaders who had believed the war would be a turning point in race relations. It was not to be. Thurman entered Morehouse during what would later be called the Red Summer of 1919, a series of murderous riots directed against black Americans in Georgia and elsewhere. Thurman would later write of this time that when the troops were mustered out, like a tremendous octopus, American society sought to place the Negro back into his place of anonymity. The fall of 1919 also marked the ebbing of the final wave of the Spanish flu pandemic. Thurman, as far as we know, had been lucky and had not been sick. A few years later, he wrote that the pandemic had been an equal opportunity infector. It paid no attention to race, creed, nationality, or color. It demonstrated whether or not human stupidity wanted to recognize it, that, in Thurman's words, the essential kinship of peoples, and as he would always preach, all life is one. All life is one. If you want to get close to Thurman's vision of God, ponder that simple phrase, all life is one, not as a throwaway cliche, but as the vision of an infinitely connected and interdependent universe. But as Thurman always said, mystics like himself, like everyone else, still had to live in the real world. Morehouse in 1919 was becoming more and more of a real college. Like many historically black colleges in the early years, Morehouse originally had extensive pre-collegiate educational programs, but by 1919 they had been closed. The college had recently built its first dorm, so students could live on campus rather than boarding with local families. And by 1919, Morehouse had largely completed the transition from an institution largely run and staffed by Northern whites to a college with John Hope as the college's first black president, was black leadership and faculty. College had always been a time of transition between adolescence and adulthood. A 1918 advertisement from Morehouse described the college as an institution famous for its emphasis on all sides of manly development. But of course, for black men at that time, becoming a man was not just about maleness. It was a time when, as Thurman wrote in his autobiography, our manhood and that of our fathers was denied on all levels by white society, when grown men had to regularly absorb the indignity of being called boy and uncle. Women were never addressed by Miss or Mrs., but as auntie, and never called by their family names. And of course, as Thurman noted, both black men and women were called worse names as well. Being addressed with racial slurs was hardly the worst of it. It was a time, Thurman wrote, when the state of Georgia was infamous for its racial brutality. Lynchings, burnings, unspeakable cruelties were the fundamentals of existence for black people. Our physical lives were of little value, and those of us who managed to remain physically whole found our lives defined in less than human terms. And so, Thurman writes, fresh from Florida, when I went to the chapel for the first time, and John Hope, the president of the college, leaned over the podium and addressed us as young gentlemen, Thurman felt he was entering a new world. For a few minutes, he felt he was not quite in Georgia, but had entered a new space where, in his words, the seeds of self-worth and confidence long dormant began to germinate and sprout. Thurman blossomed at Morehouse. He was not a typical Morehouse man. Most were sons of the small black middle class. Thurman came from a poor, largely fatherless family in Daytona. It had been a challenge for him to get into high school, and he was only able to get into Morehouse because of a scholarship. But once he arrived in Atlanta, he became, as his yearbook entry stated, the personification of the Morehouse ideal. He was valedictorian, editor of the literary magazine, the yearbook, co-author of the class poem, winner of almost every prize the college had to offer, a star debater, an orator, a singer in the Glee Club, an actor in productions of Shakespeare, class representative to the YMCA, and so on and so on. Rather than finding this overambitious high achiever annoying, it is clear that Thurman was beloved by his classmates. They recognized what was already his remarkable spiritual gifts, and they sought him out for advice on personal matters. He had already determined his goal in life. His classmates said of him that he was our idea of a minister, one who shall furnish us with a rational and practical Christianity. John Hope's vision of Morehouse was college as a bubble, as much as possible, keeping out the negative outside influences, especially the poisons of white Atlanta. He ran a tight ship. Students were unable to leave the campus without permission. No cursing. Football players learned to keep their cuss words to themselves, regardless of how hard they were knocked to the turf. There was no smoking, no misbehaving in class, playing cards, or especially unchaperoned visits to Spelman. From sunup to sundown, Morehouse students were closely watched. It was much smaller than today, with only about 40 men in Thurman's graduating class. The faculty had orders to report infractions, and Hope did not hesitate to expel or suspend students who had broken the rules. Thurman was not much of a troublemaker, though once when he complained too loudly about the quality of the grits and gravy served in the dining hall, he was almost suspended. From John Hope's perspective, all of this discipline was necessary to create the inner strength Morehouse students needed to thrive. Because as he knew, and as Morehouse students knew, no one can live in a bubble forever. And Morehouse had to exist within an Atlanta and a Georgia in which the white segregationists who had almost all the power in the state might tolerate black higher education, but there would be no toleration for any black institution that was perceived as a threat to segregation. And so John Hope and other black college presidents had to toe a very careful and narrow line. Preservation of the college was paramount. As Benjamin Mays, who was a teacher at Morehouse during Thurman's undergraduate years, later wrote that at the time, though nobody at Morehouse taught submission to segregation, neither did anyone encourage Morehouse students by force to overthrow the system. This was a problem to which John Hope and Morehouse could have no good answer. Was Morehouse part of the system of segregation, or was it part of the effort to destroy it? You know, there's a famous saying from the 1960s, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. But often dichotomies of this sort are too simplistic. The problem with Morehouse that it was, in some ways, unavoidably both. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Morehouse students today consciously and deliberately chose to attend a historically black college. You had other options, though. In Thurman's day, with few exceptions, and none of them in the South, all black colleges were the only place to go for African Americans seeking higher education. Thurman always defined freedom as a sense of alternatives, and without freedom, a cage, however gilded or hallowed, remained a cage. Whites saw Morehouse as proof that blacks approved of segregation, and the very existence of good black colleges like Spelman and Morehouse were seen as justification for keeping blacks out of white colleges altogether. The essence of segregation, as Thurman always knew, was not the separation of whites from blacks, but the separation of black Americans from power, influence, and their rights as full and equal citizens. Let me just take a sip of water. In the first real glimpse we get of Thurman as a thinker, he was wrestling with these questions. In January 1922, just about a century ago, he delivered Our Challenge, the college's Emancipation Day oration. As you know, Juneteenth is now a national holiday, but in the early years of the 20th century, January 1st, the day in 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, was celebrated in many black communities. Our challenge opened with the statement, "Physical slavery is no more, though every black man in America finds himself chained and fettered by what Thurman called psychic slavery." And the core of the psychic slavery was that, as Thurman said, too many black Americans continued to treat the white man with the nature of a god to be honored, admired, feared, and obeyed. How to undeify white America? Did it require shunning contacts with whites as much as possible, or alternatively insisting on interacting with them as equals and watch them put their pants on one leg at a time? Thurman, one must say, doesn't really answer this question in his Emancipation Day oration, but he is sure that no one can do this for us. We have been freed, now let us be free. He had already started to challenge his unfreedom. By the time he delivered his Emancipation Day oration, he was already a pacifist and probably was already a socialist, learning lessons that were not taught at Morehouse. Thurman, like so many other young women and men after World War I, wanted to have nothing more to do with war and militarism. In his sophomore year, he joined the leading Christian pacifist organization, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and soon became its first prominent African-American member and made his first close white friends. Thurman hated war, but his pacifism was always primarily directed against the explicit and implicit violence that every black person faced daily in their lives. Once he became a pacifist, he would write, "He found a place to stand in my own spirit, a place so profoundly affirming that I was strengthened by a sense of immunity to the assaults of the white world of Atlanta, Georgia." A little more than a decade later, in 1936, as part of an extended preaching tour of India, he headed a small delegation that would become the first African Americans to meet with the leader of the Indian independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi. When Thurman returned from India, he spoke widely about what he had learned there, crafting a distinctively African American version of Gandhi's idea of radical nonviolence. The first sit-in demonstrations for desegregating public facilities followed shortly thereafter. To return to Thurman's undergraduate years at Morehouse, he also sought his intellectual freedom. He refused to accept there were any barriers that white America could impose on what he wanted to learn or study. During his college years, he was sort of an epistemological sponge, trying to soak up everything worth knowing. He claimed in his autobiography that he and a classmate, James Navrat Jr., later a key lawyer for the NAACP in the Brown case and president of Howard University, read every book in the Morehouse College library. His concentration in Morehouse was not religion, but economics and sociology. He was tired of pious sermons about the goodness of God, and he wanted to learn how things really worked and penetrate the secrets of American capitalism and understand why there was so much misery and so much black misery in a country with the vast resources of the United States. At the suggestion of Benjamin Mays, his trigonometry professor and debating team coach, Thurman decided he had to seriously study philosophy. And in the summer of 1922, he crossed the Mason-Dixon line for the first time and went to Columbia University in New York City for a course in reflective thinking. Thurman thought this was the best course he ever took because it taught him not to accept as true statements you haven't fully analyzed, or not to accept as true statements because some authority in a book writes about it, or someone from a pulpit tells you you have to believe something. This became a basis for Thurman's understanding of education, politics, and perhaps especially religion. And the real reason Mays and Thurman wanted to study philosophy is because they thought the leaders of black colleges at the time were afraid of serious discussions of fundamental questions. To quote Thurman, they were afraid that a serious discussion of philosophy would bring under critical judgment the society and our predicament within it, and would contribute to our unease and restlessness. And this in turn would be disastrous for us and our people. Thurman disagreed. He thought black college students could handle the darkest and hardest truths of American society without falling into incapacitating despair or giving up hope for themselves or others. Both Mays and Thurman would have agreed with the eminent black, I hope I haven't been off microphone, eminent black historian Carter G. Woodson, who said that in black colleges, our minds must be sufficiently developed to use segregation to kill segregation. At Columbia, Thurman became acquainted with pragmatism and other contemporary schools of American philosophy, and this would be an important influence on him. But there were some lessons still best learned back in Atlanta. During his senior year at Morehouse, there were some visitors from the General Education Board. This was an organization of Northern philanthropists that over many years had given generous and crucial financial support to the college, and John Hope wanted to show his appreciation. So all Morehouse students were assembled to hear a few words of greeting from the visitors, and then the director of music came to the stage, waved his baton, and expected the student body to sing spirituals for the guests. The conductor gave the downbeat, and then there was silence. He tried again, the same result. John Hope was profoundly embarrassed. He called a special assembly for that evening, and he furiously reprimanded the student body. Thurman, one of the non-singers, told Hope that we refuse to sing our songs to delight and amuse white people. The songs are ours and a part of the source of our own inspiration transmitted to us from our forefathers. Thurman writes that it was that incident that first led him to seriously think about the meaning of the spirituals. What Morehouse students probably most objected to singing spirituals for whites, that his spirituals had attained worldwide popularity, the first, but by no means the last, of African American musical genres to do so. They acquired an association with black docility. They were seen as songs of resignation, of enduring and accepting suffering in this world in exchange for sweet chariots in the next. Thurman tried to reclaim them. For him, they were songs of survival, physical and spiritual survival. And the meaning was that everyone had the infinite equality of being children of God. The spirituals were a statement to their enslavers that my meaning does not arise from your interpretation of my significance. No judgment you impose on me, no order of society into which you seem to have regimented me can sever my roots from my inner significance. From 1928 to 1932, after graduating in 1923, Thurman returned here as a professor of religion at Morehouse and at Spelman. In the late 1920s, he taught a course at Spelman on the life of Jesus. And he and the young women in the course embarked, on his words, on a personal quest for the sense of our own worth, using the life of Jesus as an example. The racial climate was so oppressive and affected us all so intimately that analogies between his life as a Jew in the Roman world and ours was obvious. Thurman asked, can we immunize ourselves against the destructive aspects of our environment? How can we manage the fear of the white man's power and not be defeated by our own rage and hate? He started to answer these questions while he taught here and at Spelman, but it took him 2 decades for him to provide his definitive answer in his masterwork, Jesus and the Disinherited. Thurman's Jesus spoke to poor Jews, Jews without Roman citizenship in first century Palestine, and he told them they had to overcome the 3 hounds of hell: fear, deception, and hate. How do you defeat them? We don't have time here for a full discussion, but it begins by refusing to give in to crippling fears. And the essence of the religion of Jesus was that, in his words, you must love without cowardice or fear, you must be wary without hypocrisy, and you must be full of peace without contentment. For Thurman, this was not only the basic message of Christianity, but of any and all authentic faith traditions. Jesus and Disinherited is a good title for the book, but Thurman had wanted to call it The Hounds of Hell. But his editors thought it sounded too much like a Sherlock Holmes mystery and turned down the suggestion. But I liked Thurman's proposed title, which is why I called my biography Against the Hounds of Hell. All of this for Thurman was a part of growing taller, stretching towards the crown. He was not an activist, but he was an inspiration and mentor to many of the leading figures of the Black freedom struggle: James Farmer, Pauli Murray, James Lawson, Martin Luther King Jr., Marion Wright Edelman, John Lewis, and many others. Because he preferred to stay in the background, providing counsel to the movement's leaders but shunning the spotlight, many participants in the struggle did not know his name, but they were soldiers in a nonviolent army that he had helped to summon. Writing in early 1963, Thurman marveled, perhaps the most significant thing that has happened in the last few stirring years of the vast struggle for civil rights in the South and the North has been the dramatic loss of fear on the part of masses of Negroes. They were triumphing over the hounds of hell. Thurman thought that the fight against segregation had to be a two-front war to be fought by strengthening Black institutions like Morehouse and at the same time creating integrated spaces in which people of all races could create their own community. In 1944, Thurman left Howard University to become pastor of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco, one of the first churches in the United States organized as a consciously interracial and interdenominational congregation. How did Thurman help Morehouse and the generations of Morehouse students that have followed him grow towards the crown? Rather than me talk about this, let me offer the words of somebody far more qualified, Benjamin Mays. In the spring of 1981, Mays, then President Emeritus, addressed a baccalaureate service here shortly after Thurman's death, reflecting on their 60-year friendship and his roots in the Morehouse connection. Mays' language was gendered, but it applies equally to men and women. Mays said that some men are born free, others are born slaves. Howard Thurman was born free, and free men have a way of knowing other free men as a magnet, and they are drawn together. Howard and I were both determined that lynching, segregation, and denigration would not beat us down. We were not going to let the white man's world destroy us. We knew that by instinct we were free, created by God, and God being God would not and could not create men as slaves. Mays compared Thurman to other free persons, to Moses, who, as Mays said, preferred to suffer with his people rather than be the son of Pharaoh's daughter, to Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, to Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, to both W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and to the black Africans who committed suicide by jumping overboard, drowning themselves, rather than come to America as slaves. Howard Thurman, Mays concluded, was born free, lived free, and died free. What was his freedom? Let me suggest that at its core, it is the freedom to define oneself and the insistence on not being defined by others. As Thurman said, if a person knows their infinite worth, they will not permit anyone to treat them as if they were of no value. And as I understand his history, this is the sort of freedom that Morehouse College has always stood for. And let me just say that this sort of freedom has nothing at all to do with the freedom claimed by the many people in recent months who've argued they are free not to social distance or to wear masks or to refuse vaccination. There is no freedom to infect or harm others. All life is one. Let me conclude, if I may, by reading the final paragraph of my biography. Howard Thurman experienced the 20th century's America's heights and depths, knowing that, to paraphrase his beloved Psalm 139, God was present when America tried to ascend to the heavens and present when it's made its bed in hell. In his democratic vision, all peoples were infinitely equal. In his world, boundaries were just lines drawn on a map, and religious creeds were just words written in a book. In his universe, everything was alive, connected, and filled with divine sparks. He wanted us to hear the small, urgent voice within and to listen to the clamor of the disinherited without. He was not cowed or intimidated by the vicious contradictions of American life, which he tried to understand and change, but neither minimized nor excused. Those touched by his message must continue to oppose humanity's most tenacious and implacable foe, our voluntary imprisonment within our fears, our lives, and our hatreds. Let us take up Howard Thurman's battle against the hounds of hell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eisenstadt. You will have an opportunity later at 5:30 in the Executive Conference Center to dialogue with Dr. Eisenstadt about his research and his book. We purchased 60 copies of his book for students, and they have been given out. How many of you brought those books with you? Okay. In the lobby, we're going to give Dr. Eisenstadt a chance to autograph your books. You may be wondering why I'm attired like I am. This stole has on it the seals of the great religions of the world. And most of these seals are on the floor of the reflecting pool around the obelisk, the Bin stone, which is Dr. and Mrs. Thurman's International Memorial. I chose to place those seals on the floor of the reflecting pool as a tribute to Dr. Thurman, who probably is among the most widely read Christian theologians by an interfaith audience. I want you to let that marinate. It is often said that if you only know one religion, you don't understand any. Think about that. For that reason, Dr. Thurman encouraged interfaith engagement. It's important to leave home. You know, we've said for years at Morehouse that if you think your mother is the best cook, it's a clear indication that you don't travel. Okay. It's very important to leave home. Thank you very much, Professor Eisenstadt, for your research, your commitment, and your insight on Morehouse College's origins. I think we need to take every opportunity we can to understand where this little college came from, how it survived, the challenges. Because if you're watching the news today, if you watched it this morning or yesterday, I hope you realize that you're in a very similar place in this country that Howard Thurman was in 1919. They are trying to legally make you unequal because your skin is dark. Now, you know I could say a whole lot more about that. Okay, but I'm encouraging you to do something different this evening and to show up here and participate in what Dr. Thurman emphasized would be a harder thing than dying. And what was that? Thinking. Did I get that right, Luther? Okay. All right. As is our custom, I invite you now, if you're able, to rise for the singing of Dear Old Morehouse.